All right, let's go ahead and get started. Apologize for the lack of break between the previous session and this one, but there is a break after this short 1-hour session, so that'll be a good time to use the bathroom if you need to. So welcome to this first session. My name is Frank Am. I run the North Korea program here at USIP, and this session is on denuclearization and a peace regime for the Korean Peninsula. I was hoping that we'd be in a more positive situation than we are today. Basically, since the first summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim in Singapore in June 2018, the two sides have not been able to find common ground on denuclearization steps, as well as sanctions relief and other corresponding measures. Today, we're just over a month away from the end of the year deadline that North Korea has set. So I think North Korea has also refused to re-engage with the U.S. Both at the working level as well as at the leader level, until the U.S. indicates a willingness to offer more flexibility on denuclearization, on sanctions relief and security guarantees. So the two main questions we have before us today is, what are the prospects for any sort of agreement before the end of the year? And two, if there is no agreement, what does it mean for tensions on the peninsula and for inter-Korean peace-building measures? We have an excellent panel here today who will share their thoughts and insights on these questions. I'll give them about 7 minutes or so to speak, and then we can open up for a discussion with the audience. And let me quickly introduce the panelists in the order that they will speak. First, we have Dr. Lee Jung-chul, who is a professor of political science and international relations at Sungsil University. He also serves as an advisor to the Ministry of Unification. Next, we have Joel Witt, who is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and the director of 38 North. He was also a former State Department official who helped to implement the 1994 Geneva Agreed Framework, as well as its implementation. Third, we have Dr. Lee Hae-jung, who is also a professor of political science and international relations at Chungang University. He's also an advisor for the Ministry of Unification, as well as for the Blue House, their Office of National Security. And then last, we have Jean Lee, who is the director of the Korea Center at the Wilson Center. She was the Korea bureau chief for the Associated Press from 2008 to 2013, and she also established the Pyongyang bureau for AP in 2012. So with that, let's go ahead and start with Dr. Lee to my left.
네, would you please wear devices? Yeah. I try to talk in English. In Korean, sorry.
The North Korean system continuously advanced in U.S. negotiations that the United States should show direct action, as North Korea shows direct action too. And also during the six-party talks, North Korea wanted the direct participation in a light water reaction work. And even now, in their denuclearization, they want the U.S. to take a specific action. And so in Hanoi, the North Korea said that with denuclearization, the U.S. proposed that economic development assistance in exchange for denuclearization. But North Korea rejected this and said that this is what for South Korea to do, not directly the United States. And so this is related to confidence building. Even now, the United States, in terms of giving a direct compensation to North Korea, is not befitting for a superpower to do this. And in terms of North Korea, it is saying that it may not be fitting, but for negotiations to proceed, the United States needs to take direct action. And so the United States in terms of United Nations sanctions, that at the end they said that they could help with sanctions reduction, and North Korea said that for each step that they take, they need to take corresponding economic sanction reduction. So they need to make a new system with every step. So in terms of North Korea, we don't think that there are many hopes for progress with talks between North Korea and the United States. So a lot of people are pessimistic. And Frank Holm asked about the prospects of next year. And if we continue in this way, I believe that North Korea will continue the red line that the U.S. and Korea has set. They may transgress that red line. And I think the biggest victims of that transgression will be South Korea. To avoid this situation, the South Korean government is hurriedly in talks with North Korea, with the United States, and also with North Korea. So there's a Korean saying that taking the first step is half of the progress, entire progress. So the Yongbyon should be dismantled, and the United States should accept this dismantlement first, and that this, in compensation for this, UN sanctions, at least one, could be relaxed. Or by relaxed, we don't mean simply suspending it. We mean that a new UN sanction will be created. It doesn't mean just the U.S. acting alone. And so creating a snapback clause that will help assist with the progress. So I'd like to say one more thing. Next year, the Tokyo Olympics will take place. And in 2017, fire and fury was threatened. We overcame this, and there was a relatively peaceful state in 2018. And before next year's Tokyo Olympics, I think that Korea, U.S., and Japan should get together and take trilateral measures to try to reduce tensions. And in 2021, there's also the Peking Olympics. And then I think that there should be negotiations. So there should be a truce every time there is an Olympics, and having this kind of periodic truce with different allies will contribute to reduction of tension.
Please bear with me.
It's on.
It's on? Okay, great. Let me get rid of this piece of electronics. Thanks, Frank. I really appreciate the invitation to talk here today. Since we only have 7 minutes, I'm just going to make 3 quick points. And I apologize if this overlaps with what other people have said. And I know some of you have heard me before give my spiel. So I always try to add something new, and hopefully I've done that this time around. First, yes, we're not in a good spot. And I would say that the chances are 80-20 that by the end of the year, the diplomacy is going to fail here. And I think it's been particularly obvious since what happened in Stockholm. My impression is the United States went into that meeting with a fairly flexible and forthcoming position. But the North Koreans were just there to ambush the Americans. They sat, they listened politely, and at the end of the session, they read their statement in private, and then they came out and read the statement in public. They came with the statement, the negative statement. So it's pretty obvious since then also that the North Koreans just aren't responding. And they're not responding to attempts to restart engagement. And they've even trashed the Swedes in the process. The Swedes have been trying to be the intermediary in this process. Secondly, I say 80-20 because given my experience over the past 20 years with the North Koreans, you can never be sure what they're up to. I mean, it could be that we're already over the brink, the window is closed, or it could be that they're trying to squeeze more and more out of the United States and South Korea, more and more concessions. So I am willing to play out to see if that 20% is real or not. And so what we need to do is to give diplomacy one last shot here. I know that Washington is trying to do that. The recent cancellation of the air exercise was certainly intended for that purpose. It was a step in the right direction. Our friends in South Korea have offered to give North Korea 50,000 tons of food aid through the WFP. That's been rejected. The U.S. initiative with the air exercise has been essentially rejected. So what I would say here, if we're focused on diplomacy, we're doing too little, too late. And that leads me to what I think needs to be done, which is administer shock treatment to this patient on its deathbed. And I think we need to seriously consider a proposal to suspend U.S. ROK exercises. All the exercises in the spring, whatever they are, reduced otherwise, we need to consider a proposal to suspend the exercises, number one. Number two, we should offer to the North Koreans the prospect of President Trump visiting Pyongyang, not what he's done before to just visit, meet, reach a statement that maybe has 3 phrases in it and go home, but to visit Pyongyang after U.S. and North Korean negotiators work out some details. We need to put more flesh on the bones. There's a lot of talk about what should we do in denuclearization talks. I've been through this a million times. When you're in the U.S. government, you know, you have guys sitting there working out roadmaps 24 hours a day. And once you get into the talks, the roadmaps often go out the window. But I'm going to make my own suggestions here, which is that in the nuclear discussions, I agree. I think getting rapid disablement of Yonbyon is a fine first step. I know a lot of Americans want to go beyond that. I don't think that's going to be possible in the beginning, and I'm fairly certain it won't be possible. And in return for that, yes, you know, we'll figure out sanctions lifting, what to do there. But the key here is rapid disablement, not dismantling Yonbyon over 10 years. Rapid disablement can happen in weeks, if not months. And there's a whole raft of other political and security measures that can be taken. Everyone knows what they are. They've been discussed in the meetings between Americans and North Koreans. I think they're not the problem. It's this central issue. Third, since this is only 20%, a 20% chance of success, we need to be prepared for failure. And quite frankly, right now, we aren't even close to being prepared for failure. And I'll just mention one thing. In order to be prepared for failure, we need a strong alliance. That's the bedrock of maximum pressure, if maximum pressure is possible, which I don't think it is. But in any case, that's the bedrock. And how can we have the bedrock ready if we're in the middle of this big dispute about cost sharing, which I think is going to be very corrosive? And on top of that, if the diplomacy fails and North Korea starts, I don't know how they'll, how the future will proceed, but there'll certainly maybe missile tests at the very least. Nuclear tests, I don't know, but that's going to generate pressures to beef up the alliance, to strengthen our capabilities in South Korea, like THAAD, or even, it's quite possible, although probably not the Moon administration, but it's possible there will be growing pressures to redeploy American nuclear weapons in South Korea. I think the combination of these trends is going to create great stress on the alliance. Certainly with the Moon administration, I don't know how it would react to if we wanted to beef up the missile defenses in South Korea, and also with whatever comes after the Moon administration. So these are going to be serious problems with the alliance that we're not even thinking about now. We need to look beyond the diplomacy with North Korea and try to look a little bit over the horizon to prepare for things if they don't work well. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Joel. I know people don't like to give predictions or be too prescriptive, so I appreciate that you're very specific in some of your recommendations. Professor Lee.
Yeah, apologies first. Term, I will not be specific, and I think we are at a critical juncture, faced with changes whose scale is epic and structural and potentially transformative. And I'd like to just give some observation on focusing on asymmetries and the relationship between North Korea and United States on the issue of the nuclearization. I think it's still the basic terms of deal is asymmetrical in the specific sense that North Korea had to abandon or give up their capabilities. And in return, they want sort of U.S. stopping abandonment of so-called, what they call, hostile policies. So it is a trade or deal between capabilities on the one hand and willingness on the other hand. So it is asymmetrical because United States, even if the U.S. totally agree with North Korean demand that just abandonment of its hostile, so-called hostile policy, United States had the capabilities to destroy North Korea. And second point, in terms of capabilities, the asymmetry on the one hand, North Korea, and on the other hand, United States, aligned with South Korea, has been increasing because the Trump administration sort of doubled down on military capabilities, increase all the conventional and nuclear capabilities, and South Korea as well. So ironically, after a lot of engagement from the beginning of 2018, the asymmetry actually has been increased. And in terms of willingness from the part of the United States, I think there is a symmetry or mismatch on the one hand, the United States abandoned its deal with, for example, with Russia, intermediate nuclear forces agreement, and it just broke its deal with Iran. But on the other hand, it's the Trump administration's official position is we are willing to engage USIP in North Korea. So there is a big gap between America's sort of overall or global policy on the issue of denuclearization and US policy toward North Korea. And last point on asymmetry between United States and North Korea. There has been a sort of complete reversal of American policy toward North Korea from the bottom up to top down. Everyone knows it. And there is a big asymmetry in terms of political capital and diplomatic efforts from North Korea's top-down effort to engage with United States. But the Trump administration, the top, Trump himself, is so much consumed with the other impeachment and all the problems. So there is a big gap on the top level in terms of their efforts coordinate everything else. So it is a sort of scholarly observation on the structural position and just very general comments what we should do. Number one, because this is a critical time point, we should sort of recognize the reality as it is. We should be present. And because this is a structural changes, we are faced with the structural changes, we should be practical, okay? And on the alliance issue and all those potentially transformative ramifications, I think we should be persistent and we should believe in democracy. The bottom line on the alliance issue is South Korea is a democracy, United States is a democracy, North Korea is not a democracy, China is not a democracy. So there is a huge gap between North and South Korea and China. Democracy is sort of our common bond. And how then alliance issue could be solved or resolved in a democratic way? That's a big challenge for us. That's it.
Thank you very much. And then Jean.
So what do I add to this discussion? I think I might build on what you discussed, what you alluded to, and perhaps put it in psychological terms. When we look at where we are in terms of the state of play between North Korea and the United States, I think I'm looking at it from a psychological dimension. You know, I'm just sitting here, when I was listening to the unification minister speak, I was thinking back to a year ago when we hosted the previous unification minister and the Korea Global Forum at the Wilson Center. 2018 was such a different beast. It was such a different year. What a difference a year makes. And you know, at that time, we were coming off of this sense of South Korea playing this integral role as a facilitator, playing this the President Moon playing this role in providing Kim Jong-un or the North Koreans with this international platform that the Pyeongchang Olympics offered, paving the way for him to step out diplomatically into the world and have that historic summit with Donald Trump. And I don't think that a year later, where we are now, is where anyone had expected us to be. And that includes the North Koreans. So when I put it into the larger context, I think Kim Jong-un is still trying to figure out what happened in Hanoi and still trying to figure out how to get these talks back on track. Right now, what we're seeing is Kim Jong-un, I think he's still interested in another summit with President Trump. And some sort of a deal. You mentioned the Tokyo Olympics, but I'm actually looking at the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, and that's because that's going to be in June of 2020, and that's because as a journalist who was on the ground in North Korea, we tend to look at everything from our calendar in the outside world. They have a different calendar that they're operating by, and if if I were a North Korean bureaucrat, I would be looking according to that calendar and trying to figure out what steps we want to take to get to the point. So is that anniversary going to be a celebration of peace with the United States that Kim Jong-un can claim credit for, or is it going to be a celebration of the hostility? I think that that's the question, that's the time frame I'm looking at. Right now, I think that what we're seeing is Steve Biegun's office trying to quietly behind the scenes entice the North Koreans back to the negotiating table. President Trump, more publicly through his Twitter feed, trying to push those negotiations forward. I just want to mention, it was just Sunday that the Secretary of Defense postponed those drills. They used to be called Vigilant Ace. Those are drills that had been scaled back. Actually, Frank, please correct me if I'm wrong because you know this better than I do. Scaling them back was a concession. And while Secretary Esper may say, this is not a concession, I understand that he wants to silence critics who may criticize him for offering a concession. It is a concession. The Americans have to own it, and they have to make it clear with the North Koreans, we are giving you something big here, and you need to understand that in the transactional mode of operation or negotiation, you have to understand that this is a step we are taking. Now let's move forward. But the North Koreans, honestly, they don't have that much to work with. They don't have that many tools. They use access and they restrict access to them as a way to gain leverage. That's what they're doing with the South Koreans. By sidelining the South Koreans, they are trying to create that anxiety in South Korea, in Seoul, that they are this Korea passing phenomenon of not being included in discussions that have such a huge bearing on their future. And also trying to sow dissent, I think, even within the Trump administration. So it's not just about trying to create a divide within the alliance, but I think I also see some sowing of dissent within the Trump administration. So it was very interesting in the recent statements from high-level North Korean officials, in which a high-level North Korean official directly criticized President Trump. And so Kim Jong-un is getting his message and his displeasure out there without getting himself involved. So he's leaving a little bit of room for that personal diplomacy to perhaps come into play if the time is right. So really the North Koreans are trying to improve their position in whatever way they can so that when they sit down for those negotiations, they can be sure that they'll get more of what they want. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I'm trying to offset the pessimism on the panel. And I would say there are a couple other things that we need to watch out for. The sowing of dissent, the divide and conquer technique. I mean, I have to tell you, living and working in North Korea for 3 years, I had to do that every minute of my day in North Korea. Everything was a transaction. If I wanted to go to the bathroom, I had to negotiate. I mean, it really is a country where everyday life, not just at the political level, but in daily life, is dictated by your negotiation and by a transaction. So we need to understand that. And also using the divide and conquer technique. And so not only within the Trump administration and trying to prevent the North Koreans from doing what they did with, John Bolton, and even I think what they're trying to do with Secretary Pompeo. At the moment, Steve Biegun has been spared. Maybe they're waiting to see if they can utilize him successfully, but with the partners in the region as well. The best thing that the regional partners could do is to stand together, stand united, agree what it is they're trying to accomplish and how to get there. Just remember that Choi Sun-hee, Vice Foreign Minister, is in Moscow now, I believe, looking to perhaps convince the Russians not to send the North Korean workers back to North Korea. That deadline for the UN Security Council Resolution 2379 is coming up on December 22nd. By December 22nd, all UN member nations are asked to send North Korean workers back. So these are the kinds of things we need to watch. Are the North Koreans looking for other partners that they can go to try to divide the consensus on sanctions, to divide world opinion on how to think about denuclearization? So I just wanted to offer a little bit of that psychology based on my own experience in dealing with the very transactional nature of the North Koreans.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you to all of the panelists. We will now open it up for discussion and Q&A, and before we do that, I'll give you guys some time to think about the questions as I make one observation and ask the first question. So I think it's interesting that on one hand, you have North Korea that appears very hostile and reticent to return back to negotiations, whether it's working level or the leader level. But at the same time, so at face value, they seem hesitant. At the same time, they haven't completely dismissed returning back to negotiations. They haven't taken their ball back and went home. So they're making all these statements every day from different, the State Affairs Commission, different officials. So you get the sense that they actually do still value some sort of agreement, right? On the flip side is the United States, where the U.S. government has been saying every day, our shop is open, we're ready to play, we want to engage. They've been trying to message that point out consistently. So it seems like they want to engage. At the same time, they are willing to concede on many different points, except the one point that North Korea is interested in, sanctions relief. And so are they really interested in engaging if they're not willing to make a concession on the most important point that North Korea is asking for? So that's just the general observation I'll make. So my question to all the panelists is, as we think about sort of this Venn diagram, the basket of things that North Korea wants, the basket of things that the U.S. wants and values, is there an overlap? No matter how small, is there a sliver of an overlap where there is a basis for some sort of agreement that can be reached? I think Joel already outlined a lot of things that are sort of already on the table, but is there something that can be the basis for some sort of interim or small-term, near-term agreement? And anyone can take that question. Please.
네.
Yes, last year, together with Jean Lee, we had a KGF discussion. At that time, as Jean mentioned, the situation has changed greatly, and the negotiation positions have weakened somewhat. And a lot of that, I agree with, and I believe a lot of that has to do with military exercises. The Panmunjom June 13th discussions was where President Moon talked with Kim Jong-un for 30 minutes. And during 30 minutes, Kim Jong-un requested interruption of military exercises. At that time, President Trump wanted, North Korea says that President Trump gave them a positive reaction to that. So if you meet North Koreans, they say, well, President Trump said that you would stop military exercises. And that's because South Korea requested it. And why is it still continuing at this point? So from the Moon administration point of view, the USFK Forces Korea is very important. And so without military exercises, what use is it to have them there? And so that's why they conducted the August exercises. In any event, for a long time, North Korea has requested a interruption of military exercises for a long time. And so they are saying that South Korea allowed this to happen. South Korea started military exercises. They wanted to start military exercises again. So that's why they are saying they don't want to talk with South Korea at all. So the South Korean government knows that the military relations with U.S. is very important, and so they're faced with a lot of difficulties as they talk to the North Koreans. But the Vigilant Ace exercise was postponed. And so they are trying to get a momentum with North Korean talks. And as I mentioned, the truce of 2020 before the Tokyo Olympics will be an important time point as well. In this view, we interrupted the October Vigilant Ace exercises. Why aren't you willing to talk? Is the South Korean question to North Korea. And I believe that there's one issue that's important here. Secretary of Defense Esper said that he would interrupt military exercises. And at this very same day, North Korea declared that Esper secretary is a great man. And then 2 days later, there was a critique of North Korea with the UN human rights resolution. But at that time, Japan was excluded. They stepped away from this resolution. So North Korea is saying Japan was a country that submitted the human rights resolution. Why isn't the United States recusing itself as well? This itself is a hostile act. And so this is a criticism of the United States. So they agree with the interruption of military exercises, but 2 days later, why did you take another approach with the UN resolution? Is the North Korean point of view. But I think that with time, I think that North Korea will come back to the negotiating table. And as Frank said earlier, economic sanctions are important, but domestically, the North Koreans deem very important the U.S.-Korean military exercises. And so their nuclear tests and ICBM tests, if they suspend that, you should suspend military exercises. So suspension for suspension has been a premise of all North Korean negotiations. And so I think that they believe that that is very important. But when you go into the talks itself, they will talk about compensation for economic sanctions.
First, I don't see anything surprising here about North Korea's behavior. You know, the idea that they're trying to divide all of us and they're working with Russians, they're working with Chinese. This is what they've been doing for 30 years. So there's nothing surprising here, and I don't think anyone is surprised by that. What we need to do is to focus on the problem at hand. Second, the problem at hand is that both sides have made concessions. Jean is right. Canceling the air exercise, that's a concession. Scaling back our exercises over the past year, that's a concession. Let's not forget North Korea has made concessions. No long-range missile tests, no nuclear tests. We all forget about that. Most people sort of say, oh yeah, they did that, but so what? Well, if you know nuclear technology and missile technology, they were actually headed on a dangerous path before they suspended those tests, short of the new developments they were working on. Third, you asked about overlap. You know, there's overlap if both sides want to negotiate. There's lots of overlap here. But what's going on, if we're taking the best case scenario, is that the North Koreans are pushing us to what they think might be our bottom line for talks. And so, you know, we're starting to move in that direction. We did in Stockholm. we were very flexible on a lot of different important issues. And now after Stockholm, we're moving more with the air exercise. So if you're taking the charitable interpretation here, this may continue at least up until January, if not before. Then we'll sit down and talk. But if that's not what's going on, the window may have already closed. They may have decided we'll come back again when there's a new president or in President Trump's second term. And in the meantime, they are preparing for failure. That's why they're talking to Chinese and Russians and others. We're not preparing.
I can see that as well. I think some of at least a few of the Democratic candidates for the Democratic nomination that have expressed their North Korea policy, including a willingness to consider sanctions relief. And if North Korea is hearing that, then why wouldn't they consider that a viable option? Do either of you want to also
I'm just going to say one thing about, it makes me uncomfortable to even talk about potential sanctions relief in a public forum, because once we start debating it, then as you say, the North Koreans start paying attention, and that means the U.S. loses some bargaining strength. So I think we have to assume that perhaps the negotiators on the U.S. side are looking at all these options, but they're not going to be able to talk about it, and they shouldn't. Because once you start talking about it, you're losing some ground. So I just, let's hope that it's part of what's under consideration, with caveats that they need to see something happen on the North Korean side in return.
As sort of a quick follow-up on what both of gentlemen mentioned, I think the bottom line, the minimum level or area of overlap between United States and North Korea is Yongbyon plus double freeze. North Korea already offered the Yongbyon, and United States demanded we need more than Yongbyon plus ARPA. And North Korea demanded recently, it is questionable they actually moved the goalpost further apart or not. It is a point of contention. But anyway, they demanded for double freeze. So why United States offer a little bit more lengthened time horizon, not just to this time, but there will be another round of joint military exercise in spring, summer, fall. So why not 1 year or just a half of next year? We will scale back, or we will just adjust military exercise in the spring. So why don't you come to the table? So Yongbyon, you guys already offered. We will take it. And we offered the concession, not just this time Air Force exercise, but in the spring military exercise. And we are going to talk about everything, parallel and simultaneous, including sanctions relief. So what about Yongbyon plus double freeze? No. Yongbyon plus double freeze plus ARPA. ARPA should be dealt with in the negotiation table. That's my position.
Fair enough. Okay, let's go to questions. We have basically 15 minutes or so, so that gives us time for a few questions. Let's go with the gentleman right in the middle with the glasses. Sorry, yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jong-won Lee, PhD candidate from American University. My question is, there are certain North Korean skeptics who argue that even if there is a suspension for suspension deal, as Dr. Lee mentioned, suspending North Korea's nuclear experiments in exchange for suspending U.S. ROK military exercise, they may be good for DPRK, they may be good for U.S., but it might actually be good for South Korea, since South Korea will still have to face North Korea as a nuclear country and lose some of those military readiness because of lack of exercise. So from South Korea's perspective, is really suspension for suspension deal, small deal, really good for South Korea's interests? Is my question.
The question is whether a freeze for freeze or suspension for suspension, while it may be good for North Korea, U.S. interests, is it good for South Korea's interests because they would be the victims of the lack of military readiness?
You know, whenever you're making proposals, whenever a diplomat or a U.S. government makes a proposal, you have to evaluate the different possibilities, right? So yes, you're right. Suspending military exercises indefinitely, which is not what I'm talking about, would be bad. Suspending it for 6 months, and then maybe if you get to sit down with the North Koreans, work out what that exactly means, work out exactly what the missile and nuclear test moratorium means, and then weighing that against what happens if this process falls apart. So you have to look at the different futures and come to a conclusion about what serves your interests. That's the point. I mean, we're not just making these proposals because they sound nice. You have to evaluate the impact on your interests and also things you might do to offset that impact.
And the degradation to military readiness is also bad for the U.S. military working in a combined fashion with the South Korean military. And one could also argue that it may be a positive for South Korea if that sort of freeze for freeze allows diplomacy to proceed, that allows inter-Korean cooperation to advance as well. So that may be a risk that they're worth taking.
Right.
We had a question over here, right there.
I'm Peter Humphrey, intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Are we stupid enough to trade for Yongbyon when there's at least one and perhaps two other Yongbyons? Or is there a minimum trade where we get all the Yongbyons all at once? Or are we going to go for some silly face-saving thing where the above-ground 30-year-old technology is given up, but the underground technology, the brand new stuff, is left in place?
Joel, I think you already answered this sort of in your remarks, but the question is like, is Yongbyon good enough, or should we go for the entire program?
And I'm not stupid enough just to settle for Yongbyon. There's a reason why I say that. You are not going to get at those other facilities right away. That's a given. So, I accept what you're saying. You have to tell me what you would do to solve this problem. And the reason I'm saying that is because with all the experience I've had, there's no way you're going to have to do this in phases. That's all there is to it. That's the only way this will work. So, I accept what you're saying, that you think that's a waste of time. That's fine. Then you have to, I hope, think through the implications of what you're saying. What does that mean for the future of Northeast Asia? Does that mean Northeast Asia is going to go nuclear? If North Korea's nuclear weapons program proceeds uncontrolled, what are South Korea and Japan going to do? What are the implications of that for the U.S. ROK and U.S.-Japan alliance? I don't think it's good. So that's all I'm saying, is everyone can have their own view on how to proceed here, as long as, I would say, with the caveat, that you think through the implications of what you're advocating.
I was just going to say one more thing. There's the diplomatic process, and there's also President Trump, and he could decide that that's enough for him to get the deal that he may want as a foreign policy victory in the run-up to his re-election. I shouldn't say that. I didn't say that. During his re-election campaign. So I think we have to acknowledge that as well, that there's a diplomatic process, but there's also that wild card that President Trump himself poses.
Right there.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Billington with Executive Intelligence Review. Despite the anti-Russia and anti-China hysteria that we have in the U.S. and the press and the Congress and even some within the cabinet, Trump has stuck his ground that he wants to be friends with Putin and he wants to make a deal and be friends with China. So he prefers bilateral negotiations, but nonetheless, what do you all think about the actual positive role that Russia and China could or should play, and what do you think Trump is looking for from Russia and China on this?
The role of Russia and China and what the U.S. is looking for from them.
Well, if we focus on sort of structural changes and stake, I think ROC-U.S. military alliance is faced with the competing imperatives. On the one hand, there is the imperative of readiness, but on the other hand, we are trapped in two wars. One is how to dismantling Korean War, and on the other hand, how to, at the shadow of a coming war or preventing war between the United States and China. So all these current problems are trapped in between these past, how to resolve the Korean War and how to deter or preventing very hostile relationship between the United States and China. So the ROC-U.S. military alliance is faced with, on the one hand, have to sort of maintain huge gap in terms of military power, deter North Korea, but on the other hand, transform its role, not just deter North Korean current threat, but prepare the alliance for the future, the sort of a peaceful transition and building peaceful regime. So there is another multilateral imperative that sort of in that kind of building a new peace, we have to take into account of the legitimate security concerns of China and Russia and U.S. sort of future scenarios. So it is very complicated process, and as Mr. Joel Witt emphasized that we have to weigh in the different scenarios and different risks and different opportunities. So, well, it is an open question, but we have to prepare not just to deal with North Korea's immediate threat, but how to reconcile competing imperatives of dismantling the Korean War and preparing for a prosperous Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia in the future.
I'll just say we have to recognize that each country has its own interests. Each country has its own complicated history and relationship with the other countries in the region. But I wanted to mention those UN Security Council resolutions from 2 years ago. It was an unusual opportunity or occasion when China and Russia signed on. It was very unusual. That sent especially China's involvement or signature sent a strong message to Pyongyang. So that's an example of when China and Russia do sign on to a US-led effort. But we'll see what happens. It's, you know, that 2-year deadline is coming up. We'll see if North Korea succeeds in dividing that unity. Remember that we had Kim Jong-un in the wake of the failure at Hanoi, the breakdown of those talks, go to Vladivostok and invite Xi Jinping to Pyongyang. Did I get that right? I think I have that right. In each case, got a little bit from each of them, but didn't get exactly what he wanted, which was sanctions relief. And so those are small examples, or perhaps significant examples of China and Russia supporting this effort to bring North Korea to the negotiating table.
Any other thoughts on this question? Okay, just a few minutes left, so let's take, I think there's a question down here. Yes.
Diane Rennick, Congressional Research Service. So there's no appetite for sanctions relief on the Hill at all. And all the sanctions that the U.S. has in place are codified in law. So how do you go about getting sanctions relief?
유엔 제재 관련
When it comes to the UN sanctions, there were discussions in Stockholm And the U.S. Had indicated that the coal and textiles, these products, export control may be moratoriumed for 3 years. I understand that a Japanese newspaper had indicated that these were some of the offers on the table made by the U.S. Side. And I understand Fox News had also indicated a similar news to be true. Now, sanctions really are dependent on the interpretation of the moratoriums or relief to be provided for these sanctions. But for the North Koreans, if you wanted to work with the interpretation only and not with the actual resolution or the law, they were not happy with that because it means the U.S. can dial it back anytime because it's a matter of interpretation. What the North Koreans have wanted was a new resolution to be passed through the UN. So a new resolution would indicate a different sanctioning regime, and such as JCPOA snapback could be introduced. That's what the North Koreans wanted, I understand. So from the Hanoi meeting way back now, North Korea had indicated that snapback could be an option. That's what we hear from North Koreans. So that's what I'm saying, that this is an approach that could be accepted, but the U.S., they do not want to go through a new resolution because you need China and Russia to, again, sign on to these resolutions. Now, that's a difficulty because the U.S. may not in the future have the consent of Russia and China to sanction North Korea again. 짧게.
Diane, you know a lot more about sanctions than I do, so. But what I would say, if tomorrow through some magic that President Trump reached a deal with North Korea that started us down the road of denuclearization, and parts of it had to do with sanctions and part of it required action on the Hill, I doubt if there would be any Republicans up there who would say, nah, we're not going to do it. And I bet you a lot of Democrats would go along too, because it's my experience. When you go up to the Hill, you try to sell an agreement, they're sitting there saying, nah, this is no good. You say to them, well, gee, okay, we'll go back, but this could mean fire and fury again. They'll all back off.
And as you know well, I would just add that certainly there's no appetite for providing relief related to the unilateral U.S. sanctions. In fact, it's a matter of law when sanctions relief is allowed. But I could see, something related to exemptions or waivers of multilateral UN sanctions based on the Security Council resolutions that the administration could go for. Congress might not be happy about it, but that would be a first start. Yeah. All right, let's just take one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Back there.
Thank you. I'm a master's student at American University. I have a question to Mr. Witt. So South Korean Navy is reviewing developing South Korea's own nuclear-powered submarine. And if diplomacy fails and North Korea increases the level of its threats, in terms of South Korea's missile defense capability, do you think that the U.S. will support such plan? And what is your opinion about the effectiveness of such plan?
Are you talking about a nuclear-powered attack submarine or a nuclear-powered submarine carrying missiles?
Carrying missiles.
Carrying missiles?
Yeah, in terms of defense.
Well, that has nothing to do with. Yes. Okay. So it would give South Korea another basing mode for missiles to attack North Korea. I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, really. I don't know what more to say about it, honestly. I mean, even North Korea's ballistic missile submarine. I mean, there's a lot of hype out there in the press about this one clunky 1960s submarine that you could probably hear leave port right now if it left port from here. So the thing is not survivable, carries 3 missiles, and wouldn't get very far out of port before it was sunk. So I don't know what to say about a South Korean ballistic missile submarine, really. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us for this first session. The next one starts around 3:10, so please use this opportunity for a restroom break if you need it. And thank me in joining me for applying the panelists. Thank you so much.